Part of learning jazz, in my opinion, is learning about the players. There is no better way to learn about a player than a published biography. In this video, I'm going to be discussing 3 biographies about jazz guitar players. Now, there's quite a few biographies about different jazz guitarists, which I aim to do in this multi-part series, but in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the biographies on Grant Green, George Benson, and Ted Greene. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, Jamie Holroyd here, helping you learn jazz guitar. Welcome to the channel. If you're new to jazz and you want a structured start on getting started, then please check out my free beginner jazz guitar ebook, which is linked below. The first biography that I'd like to share with you is called My Life with the Chord, Chemist, and it's by Barbara Franklin. This is about the fantastic jazz guitar player Ted Greene, and it's actually written by his partner Barbara Franklin. Now, this book is a little bit different from a few of the others, actually. It's kind of one of the most unique biographies that I've ever read because it's more like a diary, really, for the most part, about Ted's life. There's basically documentation of year by year, month by month, about Barbara's experience with Ted. They basically start at the very beginning, and there's a little bit of brief introduction about Ted's upbringing and his early life, but for the most part the book focuses on Barbara's life with Ted. One thing that I really like about My Life with a Chord, Chemist is that it focuses on Ted's personality and who he was as a person, really just as much as the professional side. Most biographies will just focus on the professional aspect of the musician, but this biography really helps you get to learn about Ted as a person and some of his other interests besides music, such as collecting coins, baseball, hot rod cars, things like that. This book contains many of Ted Greene's handwritten examples. There's basically chord grips and kind of etudes and things like that, which are all included as part of the book, so you're not going to go short of any of those things whatsoever. Another thing I like about this book is that Barbara included Ted's gear notes, so whenever Ted did a seminar or a gig, it seemed like he noted down which guitars and amps he used and then his thoughts on them. So throughout the book there's little diaries about the various gigs that Ted did, and he would say which guitars he liked, which amps he liked, which ones he didn't. And for some reason I find that very interesting. I know that's a very niche thing, and if you're not a guitar player then you're probably not going to read this book, but if you are interested in that type of thing then that's a nice little feature. The next biography that I'd like to share with you is an autobiography by George Benson called Breezin'. The thing I like the most about Breezin' is that it combines George Benson's personal story and the jazz history of the 1960s. There's excellent information about organ trios, the jazz scene in New York, as well as how George Benson worked his way up through playing with different bands to recording records under his own name. Lots of in-depth information about that. I was skeptical when I first picked up this book that maybe his early career might not be as covered as some of the bigger things that he's obviously more commercially known for, but this gives you a fantastic insight into George's early years, from little Georgie Benson to basically becoming a jazz guitar player, then releasing Breezin' and Broadway and things like that. If you are a fan of those early organ trio records that George Benson recorded, like It's Uptown, The Cookbook, or the various albums that he released with Jack McDuff, then this book is an absolute must. There's lots of things about these albums which I did not know about, like for example, one of the live albums that he recorded with Jack McDuff was not actually recorded live in the typical sense. There was problems with doing that, so they actually recorded that in the studio with a live audience, and of course there's no mention of that on any of the notes on the LP or the CD reissues. Another aspect which I like about Breezin' is that it contains George Benson's first-hand experiences with working with some of the top jazz musicians at the time. Like for example, he talks about trading fours with the jazz piano player Herbie Hancock on Billy's Bounce and how intimidated he was, and he writes it all fantastically well. There's also a fantastic Miles Davis story. Of course, many musicians around that time have their own Miles Davis stories, and I'm not going to repeat what George talks about in that book, but obviously if you are interested in that, then there's some fantastic experiences about when he worked with Miles Davis. There's also a great story about when he worked with Benny Goodman as well, which is well worth checking out. Compared to the other books that I've read, there isn't much personal information about George Benson's life. This really focuses on his professional career as well as his childhood, and he talks about his mother and his stepdad a lot. Another thing about this book is that it doesn't really go into any detail about the different guitars that George Benson used. Obviously these days and for the last 30 or 40 years he's been associated with Ibanez, so that might be why. But I was a little bit disappointed because I'm a big fan of George Benson, and I've been looking at the backs of LPs and CD covers for years, and I've always been interested in the different guitars that he used early on in his career. But it would have been nice to have some first-hand experience from the man himself about these different guitars. The final book that I'd like to talk about in this video is a biography about Grant Green called Rediscovering the Lost Genius of Jazz Guitar, and it's by Sharon Andrews Green, who was Grant's daughter-in-law. Like the other two books, the Grant Green biography contains a fantastic collection of quotes, pictures throughout Grant's life, and different comments about his playing and his personality from other musicians. The book starts out by Sharon describing how she found out about Grant Green, which is a really interesting story, and then, like other biographies, you basically go into the musician's early life, and it talks about Grant's early starts in St. Louis before moving to New York in the 60s and finally residing in Detroit in the 1970s. This book doesn't hold back in detail, it gives the full extent of the jazz musician's lifestyle. It's very honest and upfront about that. Obviously, you get the dark sides of that, the dark sides of the jazz musician career in the 60s, as well as obviously the upsides as well. There's a fantastic discography about Grant Green's recording with Blue Note Records. I think he was the most recorded guitar player, possibly the most recorded sideman throughout the 1960s, and there's a fantastic account of that with stories and everything to back that up, so you get the full information about Grant Green's recording career. In my opinion, this book does a fantastic job of combining Grant's professional life and his personal life. There's information about what Grant liked to eat for breakfast in the 70s. There was a point where he had 6 eggs, and there's all sorts of stories about Grant Green himself. He was kind of fascinated with Green being his name, so apparently he used to wear green suits, drive a green Cadillac. Little things like that are really interesting and make this book a compelling read. Towards the end of the book, there is some information detailing the guitars that Grant Green used and played throughout his career. This is good, it's better than having none, but it's not as in-depth as some other biographies that I have read, but like I said, it's a good overview and it gives you some interesting insights about Grant Green's D'Acquisto. Some other musician biographies that I've read contain a nice balance of the musician's personal life, professional life, and their playing style. So in regards to the playing style, there would usually be like notation, things like that, basically describing how the person played, their techniques. This book doesn't contain any of that. There is some broad information about Grant's style, but you're not going to find any musical examples or anything like that. So that concludes the first part of this multi-series of jazz biography reviews. What do you think about these books? Is there any that you've read that you'd like to share your thoughts on? Are you going to go out and purchase any of these? Let me know in the comment section below. I have a long list of biographies that I aim to try and get through, or at least do some of them. If there's any suggestions that you'd like me to try and prioritize, please leave those in the comments as well. And if you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel.